What if the most unsettling thing about space isn't how big it is, or how cold, or how empty, but what it quietly tells us about ourselves? We tend to look up at the night sky and feel inspired. Galaxies, stars, endless possibilities. We're taught to believe that more knowledge always brings comfort, that if we just look deeper, zoom in further, measure more precisely, things will make sense. But what if looking deeper does the opposite? Let's start with something simple. You don't need a telescope. Just think about space's distance. The farther away something is, the longer its light takes to reach you. When you see a star, you are not seeing it as it is now. You are seeing it as it was. Sometimes millions of years ago, that star might already be gone. That's not poetic. That's literal. So already, the universe is teaching us something uncomfortable. What you see is not what exists. It's what existed long enough ago for the signal to reach you. Reality is delayed. Now pause and ask, does that idea show up anywhere else in life? It does. Everywhere. Think about success. Think about wealth. Think about reputation. We see outcomes, not processes. We see the finished building, not the years of quiet construction. We see the winner, not the thousands who used the same strategy and disappeared. Just like starlight. What we observe is outdated information. And when people don't realize that, they make predictable mistakes. Let's go deeper. Space looks empty, vast, silent, mostly nothing. But that nothing isn't peaceful. It's hostile. One mistake, one small exposure, and you're gone. No drama, no second chances. The universe doesn't care how confident you were. That's disturbing if you think about it. Because we like to believe boldness is rewarded. That risk-taking is brave. That fortune favors the fearless. Space doesn't reward bravery. It punishes error. And so does real life, more often than we admit. One uncomfortable truth is this: avoiding stupidity is far more powerful than chasing brilliance. Most people don't fail because they lacked intelligence. They fail because they ignored obvious risks, trusted their emotions, or assumed the world would forgive small mistakes. It won't. In space, there is no margin for error. On Earth, there's a little more room, but not much. Now consider scale. The universe is not built for human intuition. Our brains evolved to deal with small distances, short time frames, and immediate cause and effect. But space operates on scales so large that intuition collapses. A tiny force, applied consistently over a long time, can move planets. A tiny error, left uncorrected, can send a spacecraft millions of miles off course. That's not just physics. That's life. People overestimate what they can do quickly and underestimate what happens slowly. They chase excitement and ignore compounding. They react instead of waiting. And then they're surprised by the outcome, even though the outcome was baked in long ago. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Patience beats intelligence far more often than we're comfortable admitting. Not because patience is glamorous, but because most people simply can't sit still. They confuse action with progress. Space doesn't respond to impatience. You cannot rush an orbit. You cannot negotiate with gravity. The rules were set long before you arrived. So the rational move is not to fight the system, but to understand it deeply enough to stop making predictable errors. Now think about how we explore space. We don't send humans first. We send probes. Cheap, expendable, slow-moving machines. Why? Because the cost of being wrong is too high. That's opportunity cost in its purest form. Every risky move closes off other possibilities. Every reckless decision limits future options. We rarely think this way in daily life. We ask, what could I gain? Instead of what could I permanently lose? The universe is unforgiving to that kind of thinking. Another uncomfortable truth: most people lose simply by reacting emotionally to information. Good news makes them greedy. Bad news makes them panic. But the universe doesn't change its rules based on your feelings. Gravity doesn't care if you're optimistic. Reality just keeps doing what it does. And when people mistake noise for signal, they drift off course without realizing it. Here's where the looking too deep part becomes truly disturbing. When you study the universe carefully, You start to see how small intention is compared to structure. Third step, outcomes are shaped less by desire and more by constraints, by limits, by trade-offs. You cannot have infinite growth in a finite system. You cannot push without consequences. You cannot cheat physics. Yet humans keep trying. We build stories to protect ourselves from this truth. We tell ourselves that success comes from confidence or talent or secret knowledge. But again and again, the deeper lesson is simpler and harsher. Those who survive longest are those who make the fewest irreversible mistakes. Space is full of failed stars, collapsed systems, violent endings, not because they lack potential, but because the conditions didn't allow stability. That should make us pause, because stability is underrated. Slow progress is mocked. Caution is called fear. But in a universe that destroys carelessness without apology, restraint is not weakness. It's intelligence applied over time. So when you hear claims about overnight success, or guaranteed paths, or easy brilliance, ask yourself a quiet question. Does this actually make sense, given how the world works? If it doesn't survive that test, it's probably starlight. Beautiful, distant, and already dead. Looking deeply into space doesn't just teach us about galaxies. It strips away comforting illusions. It shows us a reality where rules matter, time matters, and small errors compound mercilessly. That's disturbing, but it's also clarifying. Because once you accept that the universe doesn't bend for optimism or ego, you stop trying to outsmart it. You start trying to understand it. You move slower. You think longer. You react less. And paradoxically, that's when progress becomes possible. Not by being brilliant, but by being less foolish. Not by chasing the spectacular, but by respecting the invisible forces that shape everything. Space doesn't promise meaning. It doesn't offer reassurance. But if you're willing to look carefully, really carefully, it gives you something better. It tells you the truth. Now let's push this line of thinking a little further, because this is where the real discomfort begins. When you stare into space long enough, you start to realize that there is no central position, no privileged viewpoint, no special place where the universe revolves around you. Wherever you stand, the universe stretches outward in every direction endlessly. That means there is no natural reference point, no cosmic main character. And yet, almost every human story we tell places ourselves at the center. We instinctively believe our experiences are special, our struggles unique, our perspective essential. But the deeper you understand the scale of reality, the harder it becomes to defend that belief. The universe is not hostile, it's indifferent. And indifference is far more unsettling than hostility, because it offers no feedback, no validation, no emotional response. This indifference forces a difficult realization. Meaning is not given. It must be constructed carefully, thoughtfully, and with awareness of limits. Now consider how this affects the way people think about success. Most people operate as if the world is watching, as if effort will be noticed, fairness will prevail, and good intentions will eventually be rewarded. But space teaches a different lesson. Outcomes are shaped by structure, not intention. You can do everything right emotionally and still fail. You can feel confident and still be wrong. You can work hard and still be misaligned with reality. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths to accept. Effort alone does not guarantee progress. Direction matters more than force. In physics, pushing in the wrong direction just wastes energy. In life, it can waste years. And yet, many people keep pushing harder rather than stopping to question their direction. They double down. They cling to familiar beliefs. They interpret resistance as a signal to try more aggressively, instead of as a sign that they might be mistaken. This is self-deception in its purest form. Space doesn't allow self-deception. A calculation error is not corrected by confidence. A misjudged orbit does not adjust out of politeness. The universe reflects mistakes honestly and without delay. That's deeply unsettling, because it exposes how often we rely on stories rather than understanding. Now let's examine how this connects to long-term thinking. In space, nothing happens quickly. Even violent events unfold across unimaginable timescales. Stars form over millions of years. Galaxies collide over billions. The universe plays the long game exclusively. Humans, by contrast, are wired for immediacy. We crave fast feedback. We want quick wins, visible progress, emotional reassurance. This mismatch between our psychology and reality creates constant friction. People chase excitement because slowness feels like stagnation. But slowness is how almost everything meaningful actually happens. Compounding works silently. Damage accumulates quietly. Direction reveals itself only after time passes. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Most disasters look insignificant in the beginning. They don't announce themselves. They grow gradually, beneath attention, while people remain focused on surface-level concerns. In space, tiny gravitational tugs slowly reshape entire systems. In life, small habits, small biases, small misjudgments quietly determine outcomes. This means the real danger is not dramatic failure. It's subtle drift. Drift is terrifying because it feels like motion. You're doing things, you're busy, you're engaged, but you may be moving in the wrong direction, so slowly that you never notice until years have passed. The space probes constantly correct their course, not with large maneuvers, but with tiny adjustments. If they waited for obvious deviation, it would already be too late. This principle applies far beyond space. The earlier you question your assumptions, the cheaper the correction. The longer you wait, the more expensive honesty becomes. But humans hate early correction. It bruises the ego. It feels like wasted effort. So we persist, hoping momentum will somehow redeem direction. It rarely does. Now think about knowledge itself. The deeper scientists look into space, the more uncertainty they uncover. Each answer opens 10 new questions. Each discovery reveals deeper complexity. This is deeply counterintuitive. We expect knowledge to reduce uncertainty. Instead, it exposes how much we don't know. And that's disturbing, because humans crave certainty. We want firm conclusions, clear rules, guaranteed outcomes. But the universe offers probabilities, not promises. So the rational response is humility. But humility is not fashionable. Confidence sells, certainty attracts, doubt sounds weak. Yet the deepest thinkers remain careful, hesitant, and slow to declare victory. They understand that complexity punishes arrogance. Which brings us to another uncomfortable truth. Overconfidence is one of the most reliable predictors of failure. People who believe they understand more than they do stop asking questions. They stop listening. They stop testing. They mistake familiarity for mastery. In space exploration, this kind of thinking kills missions. In life, it kills long-term success. True understanding feels fragile. You sense the boundaries of your knowledge. You know where things could break. And because of that, you move cautiously. Now let's talk about incentives, because this is where human behavior diverges most sharply from rational thinking. In the universe, there are no incentives, no rewards, no punishments, only consequences. But human systems are built on incentives, and incentives shape behavior more powerfully than logic. People don't act based on what's true. They act based on what is rewarded. This creates distortion. Short-term gains are prioritized over long-term stability. Appearances matter more than substance. Emotional satisfaction overrides rational calculation. If space operated this way, planets would chase pleasure, stars would avoid discomfort, and the entire system would collapse instantly. But gravity doesn't negotiate. Time doesn't hurry. Entropy doesn't care about popularity. Reality functions on principles, not preferences. And the closer your thinking aligns with principles rather than incentives, the less fragile your decisions become. This leads to a subtle but profound shift. Instead of asking what feels good right now, you start asking what actually makes sense over time. That question is uncomfortable. It often leads to boring answers. It requires restraint. It delays gratification, and it forces you to confront trade-offs. You can't maximize everything. You can't have speed and safety, excitement and stability, risk and certainty. Every game closes some doors. Every choice excludes alternatives. Space is a masterclass in trade-offs. Every spacecraft design is a negotiation between weight, fuel, speed, durability, and reliability. Optimize one too aggressively, and the system collapses. Human lives are no different. Yet most people behave as if trade-offs don't exist. They pursue intensity without considering fragility. They chase growth without considering sustainability. They demand certainty without acknowledging complexity. And then they're shocked when reality pushes back. Now step back and reflect. Looking deeply into space reveals a universe that is vast, indifferent, slow, precise, and brutally honest. There are no shortcuts, no special exemptions, no emotional allowances. That realization can feel disturbing, but it can also be grounding, because once you accept that reality operates on stable principles, you stop fighting it. You stop demanding it change for you. You start adapting your thinking instead. You become more patient, more cautious, more thoughtful. You begin to value resilience over speed, understanding over appearance, and long-term consistency over short-term excitement. And quietly, almost unnoticed, your decisions improve. Not because you became smarter, but because you became harder to fool. So perhaps the most unsettling thing about looking too deeply into space is not how small we are. It's how clearly it reveals our psychological weaknesses and how plainly it shows the path to something better. If we're willing to think slower, question more, and accept that reality does not owe us comfort, only truth. Let's stay with that thought, because there's one more layer that people often avoid once things start to feel too abstract. When you really internalize how the universe works, you notice something unsettling about survival itself. Survival doesn't require understanding everything. It requires avoiding certain kinds of errors. The universe doesn't reward the most informed observer. It rewards the system that stays within safe boundaries. This is deeply counter to how we're taught to think. We grow up believing that success comes from knowing more, doing more, pushing further. But space doesn't care how much you know if one assumption is wrong. A single incorrect belief, if it sits at a critical point, can destroy everything built on top of it. That's why redundancy exists. That's why engineers assume failure, not success. They don't ask, what if everything works? They ask, what will break and how do we survive it? That mindset is rare outside of engineering, but it may be the most rational way to approach life. Most people design their decisions around best-case scenarios. They imagine success and work backward. But the universe is not a best-case machine. It is a stress test. It applies pressure continuously and reveals weaknesses over time. Another uncomfortable truth is this: robustness matters more than optimization. A system that performs well under ideal conditions but collapses under stress is fragile. A system that performs modestly but survives shocks endures. Space favors the second type every time. Now think about how often people optimize their lives for appearances, speed, or short-term performance. They make choices that look impressive but leave no margin for error, no room for bad luck, no buffer against randomness. And randomness is not optional. The universe is noisy. Unpredictable events happen constantly. Asteroids don't ask permission. Radiation doesn't follow schedules. Even stable systems are exposed to forces beyond their control. So the rational question is not how do I win big, but how do I avoid being wiped out? That question feels pessimistic to many people, but it's actually deeply practical, because survival is the prerequisite for everything else. You cannot compound progress if you don't remain in the game. This is why avoiding stupidity matters more than chasing brilliance. Brilliance without resilience burns out. Caution without understanding stagnates. But careful thinking paired with patience quietly accumulates advantage. Now consider time again. In space, time is not just long, it's asymmetric. You cannot undo motion easily. You cannot rewind entropy. Certain actions permanently change the state of a system. This is why irreversible mistakes are so dangerous. Once made, they close paths forever. Humans underestimate irreversibility. We assume most mistakes are fixable. Some are, many aren't. Health, trust, reputation, opportunity. These can be damaged faster than they can be rebuilt. And often, by the time consequences appear, the decision is long past. This delay between action and outcome is where self-deception thrives. People confuse nothing happened yet with nothing will happen. But the universe runs on delayed effects, causes precede consequences quietly. By the time results are visible, the window for prevention has closed. Space makes this obvious. A spacecraft launched with the wrong trajectory doesn't explode immediately, it just misses. Slowly, silently, irreversibly. That's terrifying if you think about it, because life works the same way. Now let's address something people don't like to hear. Not all problems are solvable. Some conditions cannot be overcome with effort or intelligence. Some limits are absolute. The universe has speed limits, energy limits, structural limits. You can't negotiate with them. You can only work within them. Yet many human narratives are built on the idea that limits are excuses, that boundaries are illusions, that anything is possible if you want it badly enough. Space disagrees. Reality says some things are possible, some things aren't, and confusing the two is costly. This doesn't mean ambition is wrong. It means ambition without understanding is dangerous. Understanding requires restraint. It requires saying, I don't know, and sitting with that discomfort. It requires resisting the urge to act prematurely. And this is where most people fail, not because they lack information, but because they lack patience. Patience is not passive. It's active, waiting. It's observing, testing, adjusting, and refusing to commit until the structure makes sense. In space science, rushing is deadly. In life, it's merely ruinous. But the effect is similar. Now, zoom out one last time. When you look deeply into space, you don't find answers to personal questions. You don't find purpose written in the stars. What you find is a system that runs on consistent principles, regardless of who's watching. That can feel cold, but it's also liberating. Because if reality is stable, then understanding it, even partially, gives you leverage, not control. Just alignment. You stop expecting fairness. You stop relying on luck. You stop mistaking confidence for correctness. You begin to think in probabilities instead of promises, in margins instead of absolutes, in time horizons instead of moments. And slowly your behavior changes. You react less emotionally because you know emotion doesn't change structure. You make fewer dramatic moves because you understand how fragile systems fail. You become skeptical of stories that ignore trade-offs, costs, and second-order effects. You don't need to predict the future perfectly. You just need to avoid the paths that obviously lead to ruin. This is not a glamorous approach. It won't make headlines. It won't impress people who equate speed with intelligence, but it works. The universe doesn't reward those who feel right. It rewards those who will align with how things actually behave. So if looking too deeply into space feels disturbing, that's because it strips away comforting illusions. It doesn't flatter us. It doesn't reassure us. It doesn't promise happy endings. What it offers instead is something far more useful: clarity. Clarity about limits. Clarity about time. Clarity about error, fragility, and survival. And once you have that clarity, you don't need cosmic answers. You don't need grand narratives. You don't need certainty. You just need to think a little slower than everyone else. And that, quietly, is often enough.